This is The Caretaker, and you are listening to The Graveyard Show.
Welcome to The Graveyard.
And welcome to another edition of the Graveyard Show podcast. I am your caretaker, and the graveyard is open. Well, it certainly has been a while. Happy 2023, everybody. First podcast of the new year. Oh, wait, we're going into April. Well, there you go. I've had a lot going on outside the graveyard that needed tending to. So, these last few months, I've had to just take care of other things. But in the meantime, just to let you know that I'm not gone, I uploaded a GYS Classic back in February. It was from 2010, and it was an interview that I did with Corpse S. Chris, who has an amazing website called Horror Host Graveyard. So he jumped from his graveyard and came into mine for a little bit. And we talked about his website. He has an amazing website that is all about the history of horror hosts. So, again, more horror host information here inside the graveyard. If you are interested in all things horror host, well, you are in the right place. I have a ton of podcasts with interviews with horror hosts. I have more that I still need to upload from 2009 and 10. Many of them were with The Undertaker, who was my fill-in host. And The Undertaker has an amazing connection to the horror hosting community. So a lot more to come, and stay tuned for that. Also, if you are just a subscriber to the podcast, as I said at the end of 22, you should really consider joining us on YouTube. Graveyard Show Podcast on YouTube is where it's at, because if you are a subscriber to this show on YouTube, well, there's a lot more that you got for this year. And I'll get into some of that a little bit later on. David Weiner is here. He is, of course, the director of the In Search of Darkness documentaries, as well as In Search of Tomorrow. He is here to talk to us about the flash sale for his latest film, In Search of Darkness Part 3. So we'll get into that, where you can go and purchase In Search of Darkness Part 3 in just a moment. This is some hot off the press stuff, folks. David actually reached out to me yesterday and said he has information for In Search of Darkness Part 3, and we are going to get into that right now. I got my butt back to my graveyard to record this podcast. To be quite honest, I wasn't sure when I was going to do one, and well, the man behind the In Search of Darkness series got me back here to do that. So let's not waste any time. As you hear in the background, a new grave is being added, and when that happens, that means my guest is here, and it's time for me to get to work. And as promised, the writer-director of In Search of Darkness Part 3 is here, a friend of the program, a great friend of the program, and the reason why I came back to start up my podcast in 2023, Mr. David Weiner is here. David, as always, it is great to have you back here in the graveyard.
It's dirty, it's muddy sometimes, but it's home. That's all I could say. And I always find myself coming back, and always appreciate you supporting the projects that we do at Creator VC. And you have multiple plots that remain open, so I will take advantage whenever you offer it up.
And you are always welcome here. You and everybody from Creator VC are always welcome here. You have carte blanche, as they say.
Wonderful.
First of all, I have to correct myself, because it is now the Rondo Award nominated and Chainsaw Award nominated In Search of Darkness Part 3.
Right.
How good does that feel?
Yeah, it feels amazing. It feels amazing. You know, listen, it's very cliche to say it's an honor to be nominated, but it really feels great. It really feels great because so many people work so hard in front of the camera and behind the camera on these projects. And so just having people respond to In Search of Darkness 1, 2, and now 3, and really appreciate it, that's reward enough. But then the icing on the cake truly is, the Rondo Awards, Fangoria's Chainsaw Award. It's these nominations are very important because it shows a wonderful validation for all the work that we've done. So I can't thank those guys enough to see it. We feel seen.
I'm really happy that they did that as well. That you got these nominations because it is such a great series. The films are great individually, of course, and then you put them together for this amazing trilogy of films. For those that have not seen it, they have to get out there and see these movies. But more importantly now, In Search of Darkness Part 3, here we are on March 28th. A flash sale has just started. It's good through April 11th. So
yes.
What can you tell everybody out there about this flash sale? Where can they go and what can they get?
Well, when we first crowdfund our projects, the backers are the priority. And now that everyone is receiving, including you, have received your care package, your scare package in the mail, and people are getting them daily, we want to be able to make it available to everybody else. So we're having a flash sale through April 11th. If you go to 80shorrordoc.com, all the info is there of what's available, and it's while stock lasts. We use a manufacturer, and we got additional stock so we could sell it during this flash sale. But you could buy In Search of Darkness 3 either standalone, or you can get all three, and that's super cool. And you get a Blu-ray, you get a digital copy of the film, digital soundtrack of the film, you get 3 posters. We have this cool this lifetime membership card that looks exactly. Maybe you could describe that one because you got it.
Oh yeah.
But it's like your classic video store membership card.
It is. Yes, exactly.
And there's bonus online content as well, and so lots going on. And we just want to make sure that everyone can have it who wants it, because this stuff, it comes and goes on streaming, but when it's on your shelf, it's forever.
It is so true, and I'm so proud to own these. I can't even imagine how proud you feel having created these with Robin and Samuel and everyone else behind the scenes, because it is such a beautiful tribute to a unique time period in history, in film history, in media history, and what these movies mean to that time period. And it's more than just quote-unquote horror movies. It's everything surrounding that. And I'll get into some of that when I ask you some questions in a minute about the film itself, because you hit on so many great pieces of 80s culture. But yes, I'm looking at the website right now. So it's 80shorrordoc.com. And you can buy the trilogy bundle. And what I love is that you can get the individual movies as well, because I know I'm missing my hard copy of Part 1. I have it on digital, so now I have to purchase.
Okay.
Yeah, I gotta buy the first one on Blu-ray to complete my hard copy trilogy. But yeah, I love this idea.
And a cool case to put it in if you want that as well.
I love that case, and as I showed on my Caretaker Reveals video segment on the Graveyard Show Podcast YouTube channel, that slip cover is so gorgeous. The back artwork that is on there with all the different creatures and villains and monsters and final girls and heroes and everything, it is so incredible. I mean, that right there you want to have displayed so people can see that thing. As far as
courtesy of Clayton Bench, who's our art director, our in-house artist, and his stuff is fantastic. He does the Roman numeral posters, and his stuff always looks absolutely amazing. But I agree, I'm proud to have that on the back, because it's sort of perfect visual encapsulation of the explosion of amazing movies that came out in the 80s.
It really is. And it's like an endless supply. I mean, I learned about movies watching your series that I didn't even know about. I'm going through and seeing some of these films. I'm like, how did I miss that? How did I miss that? Wait, how did I miss that? And I was going to say, were there movies that you were doing features that you had featured that you said, I'm not familiar with that? Did you ever come across?
Oh,
those?
absolutely. I don't claim to know it all. I was a teen in the 80s, so I lived through many of these films where, if I saw it, if I didn't see it in the theater, I saw it on the video store shelf, and I either circled it many times and finally got it, or I might not have ever gotten to it. Mm-hmm. So a project like this is also a great excuse for me to get to a movie that I'd never seen before. For example, Blood Beach. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of singling that one out because I always loved the concept of it. And it kind of disappeared off my radar, and I wondered, why have I never seen Blood Beach? Not Blood Beach, Blood Beach. And it's one of those movies that it never made the leap to DVD or Blu-ray. So when I was like, how come this just was never available? It kind of disappeared off my radar. And I realized it's because it was just completely unavailable. And so to be able to not only track it down and watch it for In Search of Darkness 3, but to be able to spotlight it and talk to talent who was part of that production, it was very, 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 very cool. And I have to say also that, so many of these movies, like Jed Shepard, for example, who's one of the talking heads, the writer of Host, which is an insanely amazing film. He, at one point, just talked about a movie called Guinea Pig, Devil's Experiment, a Japanese film. And I'm like, really? What is this? It's a short. It's not even a feature. And I looked into it, and I just saw how horrid and horrible and unique and controversial and worth discussion when we're talking about international films and Asian filmmaking. It was a great excuse to put a film like In Search of Darkness 3 to boost discussion about it.
And that's what I love about this trilogy too, is that each of the three films has its own side take, I guess you could say, or side featurette about a moment in time in the 80s, or a genre or an actor or actress, which is great. These movies, as similar as they are all very different movies as well. And having gone back and watched some of it to prep for this, mm-hmm. It's always so funny because I always love the beginning of all of them, because it's that setup of the montage of different interviewees talking about a certain aspect of the 80s, mm-hmm. and then we go right into the credits. And I always like kind of applaud when the opening credits come out for the movie, for the documentary, and it's just so much fun. And what I love about this movie is that it's the first one, I think. The other two I don't think had a quote that led off the movie.
Oh, they all do. I think because your memory doesn't serve you correctly.
Am I at that age now?
That's okay. Yeah, no. Each one starts with a quote to sort of set the stage.
Okay.
Of what you're in for. So the first one, In Search of Darkness Part 1, had a George Romero quote. The second one had oh boy.
No, there's two of us now.
Oh my gosh, the Italian. It's an Argento.
Oh, it's Argento
quote.
That's right. Yes.
But I think what I'm faltering is I think I doubled up on one of them, Part 1 and Part 2. So there you go. My mind is now focused on the next set of things.
Of course.
And so here we are, definitely showing our age in the old age home at the graveyard.
Exactly. Well, what I love about this was that you have that great John Carpenter quote where he says, "I cherish all of my bad reviews. If the critics start liking my movies, then I'm in deep trouble." So my questions are, how did you find that quote, and when did you decide you were going to start the film with that particular quote?
Well, that's one of those quotes that, especially if you watch John Carpenter talking in over the course of the trilogy, you'll find, he is the horror master. But when he's sitting down and talking, he's a bit self-effacing. He's very practical about his own work, and he's very candid about his disappointments and I mean, he was going to do, movies like Firestarter, but that didn't happen because the thing was a failure, so he got fired off of that. There's all sorts of stuff that we see the master, but he sees the hiccups and the failures and the obstacles that things didn't quite go his way. So he's much more practical at that. So I thought there was that quote perfectly encapsulated his irreverence and his cynicism at the same time in terms of how we perceive his stuff versus how critics perceive his stuff.
What I found interesting was that critics or criticism sort of seems to be more of a theme in this one maybe than the other ones, because you have a lot more, at least it appeared to me, you had a lot more Siskel and Ebert segments in this film than the previous. A lot of their clips, you see them kind of down, poo-pooing, I guess you could say, the horror genre and talking about how terrible these movies are. You have the whole section of satanic panic, or gay panic, or a lot of this sort of PMRC, the down with heavy metal, all this criticisms on the films themselves by parents and by religious groups. You have all of this criticism that seems to kind of come to a head in this movie, which I really like, because you kind of see
the moral majority, which was arguably neither.
Yes. Yeah. No, and it's true, because we're on the same age, and I remember that as well. I mean, I remember Tipper Gore getting up there with the PMRC. I remember hearing about the video nasties in the UK. I remember seeing preachers and news articles and news like 2020 and stuff doing stories about Satan and all this stuff and horror movies and and how basically if you listen to it or watch it, you're suddenly brainwashed. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. But,
sadly, plus ça change, plus c'est le même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And we're at the same spot now than we were 40 years ago in the 80s. And whether it's for clicks or for Nielsen ratings, it's, whipping people up in a frenzy to be concerned about all these sort of ghosts that may or may not exist in our lives. But by protecting us, they're actually taking away our right to choose what we think is right for ourselves and for our children. And that's something that was very prevalent in that era, and it's something that we're sadly seeing very prevalent today.
Well, it's like what Doug Bradley says in the beginning of the documentary too, where he says he felt the 80s was the decade where America tells stories about itself. I thought that was very interesting viewpoint, because watching these movies, there are things that you brought out and that your guests brought out about movies that, looking back on it here 40 years later, going, wow, that does kind of seem to be more about this than that. And, there just seemed to be sort of some of the curtain being either drawn back on something that was deliberately done, or maybe stuff that was unintentional, but there it is. You kind of look at it and go, well, it could be that too. It's very interesting.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is, spoiling a little bit of the tail end of the documentary, you've got Joe Bob Briggs, who we've just spent 5 hours sort of examining a whole era of filmmaking, the highs and lows, and the sort of real-world context that was going on, and how these films sort of fit in the zeitgeist positively or negatively. But at the end of the day, we like to reflect on these films as what they mean, something more than what they are at face value. And then you have Joe Bob Briggs, who just says, listen, these people just wanted to make a buck. but there are courses that you could take in college, to decipher what these things mean. So I've always been an appreciator of art where art is what you choose it to be. And so you could look at a blank canvas on the wall and you could find all sorts of symbolism in it, or you could say, someone forgot to paint something on here. It's all your perception.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, you hear Romero say that when he's, about Night of the Living Dead. He's just like, well, I wasn't looking to make a social statement. I just cast a lead actor who I thought was really good, and then just kind of went from there. And it's like, I can see that happening too.
Speaking for filmmakers who I am not, they speak for themselves, and they either say that it's political or not. But I think fundamentally, when anyone who is making a film, especially during an era, you can't not have a nod or two to your feelings about certain things in the world embedded in the filmmaking that you're making, the art that you're making.
Yeah.
But there are some who will just say, listen, I want to entertain, and if you want to find a bigger story there, you're welcome to do it. While there are others who are much more politically and sociopolitically minded, who want to make this an allegory of something in contemporary times or in sociological issues. So again, it comes back to beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Is it a cigar in your hand, or is it something more? Mr. Freud. Let's find out.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I was really happy to see in this one was you focused on Canadian horror movies. Well, you focus on Canadian as well as Asian horror movies, but let's talk about Canadian horror movies first, because I think a lot of us forget how many horror movies came out of Canada at that time and the quality of them. I mean, it's like anything, right? You're going to have your good, you're going to have your bad. But can you talk about the influence of those Canadian horror movies?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's hard to tell what's outright Canadian, because it's really essentially just North American filmmaking all blends together, But that's why we include Things, which is arguably many people believe is one of the worst films, in just film versus even horror film ever made. But it also is very distinctly Canadian in the way that the actors talk and the situation that they at hand and how they respond to it, and the Molsons that they drink, But what happened during that era was there was government incentive to shoot in Canada, and Canadian filmmakers, even to this day, if you're shooting in Canada, you have to have a Canadian crew. If you have a star who's not Canadian, you have to have a top player, above the line player who has to be Canadian. So there's all these rules that make something partially or distinctly Canadian, and this incentive for tax purposes happened in the late 70s. So people like Cronenberg were able to sort of take advantage of that, and all these other films like My Bloody Valentine, which you wouldn't necessarily believe is a Canadian film, they jumped on this genre as an opportunity to make a cheap film and fit it in the genre and have it sell really well at the drive-in, at the box office, and on the video shelf. But it's distinctly Canadian, sometimes on the outside, sometimes hidden on the inside.
You have Asian horror that you get into as well, and there's a lot of Asian horror that I just have not seen. How familiar were you with Asian horror of the 80s? Did you have to kind of do a lot of research, or did you kind of go into it knowing significant
That
amount?
was more of a retroactive discovery for me. I, along with so many others, I was exposed to J-horror in the 90s that really opened. I mean, I knew there was films there, obviously, before the 90s. Filmmaking didn't just explode only in the 90s, but in terms of the Western world and what we had access to, that really didn't start happening until the 90s with the boom of, Ring and The Grudge and those types of films. So for me, making this film, I wanted to tip my hat to the J-horror boom as the reason why more was made available to, Western video stores, for example. But they were always here. If you were in the right community and you knew which video store to go to. In the 80s, there were, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of video titles made by Asian filmmakers, from, in Hong Kong and across Asia. so much great stuff. Thai filmmaking, Filipino filmmaking, Korean filmmaking, Japanese filmmaking. But for me, this was an opportunity to really explore some of those titles. What was big in Asia at the time that we weren't getting any of, and what do I think is really cool, and what is also sort of drafting off of the explosion in America. They wanted to be like that. Indian filmmaking, there's like the Indian Exorcist, which is just bonkers. These films are amazing, and this was a journey of discovery for me, saying, oh, well, I knew about this film, but I didn't know those filmmakers made that film. What's this one about? So it was great to have all of our eyes open to a lot of the great creative filmmaking of the time, and I'm talking about the 80s prior to this 90s explosion.
Yeah, and I found myself jotting down some names of the movies you were showing in the highlights, because I was like, oh, I have to find this, I have to find that, oh, I have to find this.
Mr. Vampire is really fun.
Okay.
And Jiangxi vampires that hop.
Yeah.
And it's martial arts. Very much Hong Kong style martial arts. Battling demons and witches and warlocks and vampires and zombies and ghosts and the like. And it's a very different look at similar boogeymen that we experience. And so anyone who calls themselves a horror fan really should go across the ocean and check out what's there.
Yeah. Hopefully with the billions of streaming services that are out there right now, there are some of them that are carrying these in some form or another, because
more and more you're able to find this stuff now.
Yeah.
We were able to find it, it's hard, but we were able to find it, but it's still a challenge. It's very much a challenge.
Well, it's interesting because you talk about like how you see some reflection of the 80s in today's culture. You have, just in a pop culture sense, you have streaming services now versus what the VHS revolution was back then. Mm-hmm. And having sort of this wild west of, well, we need content, and you're seeing that now with the streamers. It's like, what's old is new again. It's very interesting. Well, you go to a place like Tubi. Yeah. I have no stake. I have no skin in the game at Tubi, but I love Tubi, and I shout Tubi from the rooftops because it's free, Yeah.
And it's you just get on there, and there's just a mountain of material that the likes of us just will stop and gawk and get excited about. And I, even while I was making In Search of Darkness 3, I'd be like, oh, what happened in that one scene? I just have to be real specific about that. I'd literally just jump on Tubi, and there it was, and I can get right to it. So it's an amazing source. And so we have so many streaming choices now. And some are commercial driven, and others are paid services. But there are so many free ones now, and so there's just a plethora of amazing horror and genre film that could be found in a variety of these different streamers. And all you have to do is sit through a couple of commercials. Yeah, I love Tubi. Whenever friends come up to me and they go, "Hey, what horror movies?" Well, I'll tell you a funny story. A couple of years ago, I had some young 20-something was like, "So, I know you're a big fan of horror movies." I'm like, "Yeah, I am." And they're like, "So I was just wondering, like, which of the classics would you recommend?" And I'm like, "Well, you got the 31, Dracula with Bela Lugosi and Nosferatu, and you got Frankenstein." Then I stop and I go, "Wait, when you say classics, what do you mean?" And they're like, right. Like 80s and 70s. He's like AG, not BC. Yeah, I'm like, oh, damn it. Now I'm in that age where the movies I grew up with are now the fucking classics. They are. Well, you know what? This is the thing. This person was looking to you as a guide to curate. And that's an important thing to recognize. I think all of us who are a little older who might be listening to this, when you're a younger, and we were like this too when we were young. You know, there's a mountain of movies out there, and you don't know where to start. And you hear of all the classics that you may or may not want to watch and get around to, no matter what the genre. But ultimately, sometimes subgenres specifically, you know, you need someone to sort of give you a list. That's why listicles became such a popular thing, and everyone was making listicles for a time there, and they still are. It's because you need someone who's knowledgeable to point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
You know, if nothing else, is In Search of Darkness movies, which is a trilogy which covers a whole decade over 14 plus hours, is the ultimate curation list for people who want to get started and then get embedded and then really go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
You know, across 3 films. And I'd be lying if I said I was playing a long game by doing it that way, but it was the natural progression, and I'm glad we got to be able to do it.
Yeah, so am I. I mean, I had never seen Without Warning, and I found it, and I watched it, and I'm like, damn, that is a really good movie.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, and yet you can't really find it unless, you know, you kind of dig for it. And if you didn't feature it in Search of Darkness 3, I probably would have just skipped over it if I saw it somewhere. I would have been like, all right, I'll save that for another time. And it's like,
and
wow.
I tried to get that one in part 2. We just didn't have enough time and space. There's a bunch of titles that we had, Sam Way and I put together segments that we wanted to put in part 2, and we had a cutoff, and so we just didn't do it. So I was very happy to be able to get that into part 3, and even with part 3, where you're with end credits, it's 5 hours and 42 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's still not enough time. There's still so many amazing titles that even I wanted to put in there. But just, you got to make some really tough decisions at a certain point and say, this year's too packed, we can't put it in anymore, we just got to draw the line. And if anything, apologies to the audience if the film that you love didn't make it, but you know it's out there. And so you could tell people who you think would be interested about it, and you could curate your own list.
And I find myself, even on the streamers now, whether it's on Shudder or Screenbox or Tubi or Peacock or wherever, Netflix. If I see an 80s title now, I'm usually not only saving it, I'm prioritizing it. And a lot of that has to do with, seeing your trilogy, because it just gets me in the mode. And I realized, having been a product of the 80s anyway, I could sit and just have those movies on all the time and be fine. Like, I don't.
There's a certain feel, there's a certain mood that these things that sort of brings out in you. Someone wrote a wonderful thing on Letterboxd where they said that they went through a dark time, as many of us did, especially during the pandemic. But watching In Search of Darkness 1 and 2 at the time really helped them through by watching these movies that brought in them a wonderful, warm feeling of nostalgia of these films that they experienced and loved and just knew of when they were younger. Yeah. And so you're able to transport yourself from your daily life and sort of escape into a celebration of films that no one else celebrates this.
Yeah.
Just the horror community. No one understands it. I mean, I was just talking to someone yesterday. They're like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I explained what I did, and I said, "Yeah, and it's cool. I'm a kid in a candy store. I get to interview John Carpenter and Robert Englund." And she just looked at me blankly, and I said, "Okay, well, you know the movie Halloween, right?" "Oh, yeah, I know that." "Okay, the director of Halloween, you know Freddy Krueger, right?" "Oh, yeah, of course." "Well, that's played by Robert Englund." So you can't assume, we're in our own wonderful vacuum of a community. But out there, they don't get it. And so to have a 14-hour celebration of just the strangest and oddest and craziest and most entertaining and most disgusting and most just, you fill in the blank of the word.
Yeah.
These are the movies that we love and we celebrate, and to have circle the wagons and have something that is a time capsule of the people who made these and of how these films fit in a decade and an era that are now classic, quote unquote. It's important. Listen, and I'm not saying what I've done is important, but I've been told by many people that this is important, especially to future generations who are going to come back looking for information. And this is one of the documentaries of many horror documentaries that offers this.
It is the definitive documentary. I mean, a horror documentary. I think it is, and I've seen a lot of them. I would put this. I mean, prior to this, I would say probably it was Crystal Lake Memories. I think it was the 13-hour.
Yeah.
Friday the 13th.
Well, there's the Friday the 13th, Crystal Lake Memories. There's Never Sleep Again, which is Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yep.
But I'm talking even about, and those are wonderful.
Yeah.
And those were groundbreaking in allowing me to know that fans will sit for 5-6+ hours to watch a movie. But in terms of a decade retrospective, they're harder to find. You really can't find one that's only about the 80s.
Yeah, and that's what makes these so great, is that you did 3 successful, entertaining, and informative documentaries that are over 5 hours. You have 15, upwards of 16 hours plus of movies from a 10-year span. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, it really is. They're not boring at all. They're always, you're always finding something new. They're fun to watch. You can always go back, and if you want to just watch 1 year of the movies, you can do that. You want to watch one of the featurettes, you can.
I have to interject and say I got another wonderful ultimate compliment on Twitter the other day, where someone wrote, "I learned more from 80s horror doc, In Search of Darkness." than I did in film school.
I believe that.
And I went to film school, so the magnitude of that compliment or statement, because they didn't say it to me, they just said it out there to, shouted it from their rooftop. That to me was an incredible compliment because, I went to film school. I've been working on films for years, and so the filmmaking craft is important to me, and I try and impart that in these films without hitting you over the head with it.
What everybody, well, I don't want to say everybody, but a lot of people have noticed, as I have, that this is, and they've even described it as a love letter to 80s horror. And it is, because you have that care and love and respect and enjoyment. It comes through, it shows by the way the interviews are done, the way it's cut, the graph, like all of it. It's all so well thought out that, those of us that live through it can appreciate it and love it. And those that are going back and finding out about it get a kick out of it and are loving it and going, wow, that's really cool. I mean, it's amazing how 3 movies can be different yet the same. And
yeah.
It really is. And I mean, all of you should be incredibly proud of your place in documentary history. I'll put it even out there because this is going to go down as one of the great documentaries. I know the horror genre kind of gets looked down upon by most people, but it's like, this is one of the great documentaries made. It really is. And I think the farther we get away from it, the more people are even going to appreciate it even more, and you're going to find new people who are going to find it. This right here is just something that every horror fan should have on their shelves. Now that this is wrapped up, you have now segued into part 2 of In Search of Tomorrow, the 1980s science fiction documentary.
That's correct.
So I know that's supposed to be coming out in the summer, I believe, of 2023.
Well, it's not coming out. The crowdfunding begins. Crowdfunding begins.
Gotcha. So what can you tell us about without telling us about it?
Well, what I'd love to tell you and everybody is that much like we did with In Search of Darkness 1, where it was mostly the heavy hitters, some eclectic titles, but it was mostly the heavy hitters of horror in terms of commercial recognition and so on and so forth. That was the approach for In Search of Tomorrow, part 1. But now that we sort of have a lot of that out of the way, Blade Runner, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, Star Trek II, RoboCop, Aliens, we want to now dig deeper. We want to go more onto that dusty video shelf. We want to do more of the cult films. And there's still plenty of things, whether it's sequels or a major release, we still want to do that as well. But this one is definitely an appreciation of a lot of the stuff that you discovered, not necessarily straight to video, but stuff you discovered on the video shelf. And what we are doing right now, which is something that's very important to us, is that we're doing basically what we're calling a fan consultation. And I've put together an extended synopsis of what this is about and a variety of upwards of 20 sample chapters of what we could potentially be covering. And we're inviting everyone to go to 80sscifidoc.com. Actually, if you go to our socials at 80sscifidoc, and you go to the link tree that is in our, underneath the handle, you click on the link tree and you'll see a link for the fan consultation. But in there, you'll be able to read the synopsis. You'll be able to comment and add suggestions on the synopsis. And then we have a survey that you could fill out, which you get to not only respond to some questions, but also make suggestions as to what you would like to see. And In Search of Darkness Part 3 especially was very fan-driven in terms of what do you want to see. People made suggestions, and they also even voted on their top 10 films. We don't give the results, so there are surprises. But I use that as my lightning rod. That's the guide. That's my divining rod as to where to start when I put this together, knowing that this is what the majority of people would like to see. So I invite everybody to do this survey synopsis. If they want to do that, they can jump on that as well. But this is a process that's very important to us, and we'd love everyone to be part of it.
Fantastic. I love the fact that you are so involved in getting the fans involved. It's just that's another huge reason why this is so
very
great.
Much, sorry to interrupt, but yeah, we're just it's by fans for fans. We really believe that. We're not a bunch of corporate executives at a boardroom saying, well, what tracks from our marketing? What are we going to do? We're fans. This is what we want to see. But we also really enjoy involving everyone in the process from the ground up in terms of putting a documentary like this together, doing Q&As and interviews that won't be in the film, but just they get to interact with over the course of the year of making the film. And then when the final film comes out, not only do you get your name in the credits if you back it, but you get to say, I made that suggestion and they did it. And I gave a very specific film that no one else would have known about. And look, they're talking about that, or they're mentioning it. That's incredibly satisfying, and that's, I think, incredibly rare in filmmaking, And this is not edited by committee, but there are amazing suggestions to help guide the direction that we all welcome.
Now, you also teased in the In Search of Darkness Part 3 bundle with the postcard, you teased In Search of Darkness 1990 to 94.
That's correct.
So, have you begun thinking about it, or is it something where you're just going to deal with tomorrow right now, Part 2, and then move on to
juggle
that?
as many plates as possible, and it's comical to watch me do it. We have been thinking about this for quite some time, and the validity of it, because once the 80s made way for the 90s, horror movies took at least theatrically, they took a tremendous dip and went through some serious growing pains. But there's an amazing volume of films that came out, whether it was straight to video or on the big screen, and grappling with evolution of effects, from practical to CGI in its infancy that probably wasn't ready to be center stage. And so, and just the perception of things, if you look at movies like Silence of the Lambs, or Seven, these are quote unquote thrillers, but they're horror movies through and through. They're about serial killers and, cannibalism and, and all sorts of horrible things that are extremely entertaining. So we're excited to do this, and these movies become behemoths and long projects. And it takes a toll on us as well to make these things. So this time around, what we're doing is we're dividing the 90s into part 1 and part 2, in that it's 1990 to 1994 for the first part, and then 1995 to 1999 for the second part. And they'll still be long films, but we'll be able to fit more in terms of the discussion. It won't only be the heavy hitters. We'll be able to get a lot more eclectic titles to demonstrate the breadth of the decade, and more time to discuss why things were different. Robin Bloch loves to call it the lost decade because it's just not admired like it is in the 80s, but there's still so much on display and so much value. So that's something that we can dive into.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because I know even living through the 90s, I was kind of like, But it was one of those things where a lot of the horror movies that I was finding, instead of in the video stores like the 80s, I was finding them on cable. And it would be like, Cinemax has the Bloodstone movies on, which I never would have seen otherwise.
We were absolutely spoiled in the 80s. And then in the 90s, especially in the early 90s, all these films that were coming out really much is just an extension. I mean, we draw dividing lines with a decade based on numbers. But that doesn't mean that filmmaking changed in any way, especially in the crossover between the late 80s and the early 90s.
Yep.
And so there's lots on display that's very much like a practical effects standard 80s film.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of franchises that it's known, the Scream franchise and Kevin Williamson movies, really kind of helped define that decade, but there was so much more that was available. And that's what I'm excited to dive into.
Yeah, it's so funny because I know, like, even just for science fiction, I think most people would think Total Recall is an 80s movie, and it's not.
Yeah, 1990.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, wow. But I always liken it to when you listen to music. If you ever go back and listen to, like, some of the, top 40 shows, you can always tell, like, you always have that crossover, like you just said, from a previous decade, and you have that in music, too, where you'll have like that folk music of the 60s that kind of came into the early 70s, or some of that adult contemporary music from the 70s that kind of bled into the 80s a little bit, until it finds, the decade finds its footing. It's directly influenced from previous decades.
And artists like those musicians and filmmakers making films are also drawing on inspirations and budget limitations from the films that they were growing up with.
Yeah.
And so, you look at like the Full Moon slate, Full Moon Entertainment, and, everything, from the Trancers movies to the Subspecies movies to the Puppet Master movies to the Demonic Toys movie, which I worked on the first one. I used to work at Full Moon. It's, that stuff is kind of stuck in a time warp in the 80s because they're all low budget. And it's wonderful to look and see how they fit into the equation.
Yeah, I love Subspecies. I thought those were highly underrated vampire movies, but that's a discussion for In Search of Darkness.
Shot in Romania.
Yes.
On an extremely low budget.
Yes.
And my roommate was the production manager on that.
No way.
The deep end. They threw him in the deep end of the pool on that one.
Wow.
But they somehow managed to get a film in the can.
Nothing like doing night shooting overseas.
Right.
Well, we'll have to save that one for the 1990 In Search of Darkness. I look forward to that. Well, listen,
Exactly.
David, thanks for coming back on and sharing all this information about the flash sale, about In Search of Darkness Part 3. Again, the flash sale is going on from now, March 28th through April 11th. So you can get either the trilogy, you can get the individual movies themselves, and there's all kinds of goodies that I'll go over as soon as David goes back into his plot.
Go to 80shorrordoc.com on the or 80shorrordoc on our socials, and that's got all the information. It's while supplies last, and it's really one of those things where if you value this stuff, it's nice to have a permanent home on your shelf, because I can't tell you how. Listen. This is just a tangent that I'm just going to complain, but like I want the movie Prey, Prey.
Yeah.
You know, I saw it on Hulu as soon as it came out. I thought it was spectacular. You can't own that. You have to have Hulu to watch it. It's not on physical media, and it's not even on iTunes. So I have to subscribe to Hulu if I want to watch that.
Wow.
And I also know that it won't, the Hellraiser movie, same thing. And so these things won't live forever on Hulu. So where will they be after that? So these are the kind of things that I think, it's first world problems, but it's like if you love movies and you love collecting movies and you love the instant gratification of watching something when you want, physical media, if you have the room for it, is more valuable than we realize, given the shuffle of movies that you think would always live on HBO, which are all just being sold off for tax write-off,
Yeah. So true. And folks, get out there and support this movie. Support it.
I digress.
No, it's so true, though. It really is. I mean, there is that debate going on right now about physical media versus digital media. And I still have physical media, even though you and I come from that time where we own stuff, physical stuff. I like digital stuff, but I make sure I get it onto a hard drive, because as we know, once you buy something, if you're only streaming it, if it goes away, they lose the rights to it, it's gone. And I've heard plenty of people complain. They purchase something on iTunes, and next thing you know, it's gone, and people go,
I'm still nervous about that. I've got like a couple hundred movies on iTunes, and I don't know, I feel it's unstable one day. Oh, you're locked out, or it's gone, whatever.
Oh, I download all of them. I make sure I have them because, for that very reason. Well, listen, David, as always, it's fantastic having you on the podcast. It was so great hearing from you yesterday, and I'm glad we were able to make this happen. Congratulations on all the success and the award nominations. We'll be keeping a lookout for it, and hopefully I can make an announcement here that you've got some awards for this fantastic documentary.
Well, thank you. And for those who are, the Chainsaw Award voting is already over. I'm looking forward to the show. But the Rondo Awards, you could go to rondoaward.com, and you can vote for In Search of Darkness 1 to 3 for Best Documentary if you choose. Actually, my site, which is It Came From Blog, is up there for Best Website too.
Oh, congratulations.
Keep on plugging.
Nice.
Thank you very much. But there's a million other things that you can vote for. You can vote for as many of them or as few of them as you like. But I think you have until the end of April to vote for the Rondos as well.
Yes. You can vote for this show too. Oh, wait, I'm not up for a Rondo this year.
Well, listen, you should do a write-in. Do a write-in.
I actually, the show was nominated back in 9. I couldn't believe it.
Oh, really?
I found it by mistake. Yeah. I was like, oh, my God. Yeah.
So you're a Rondo-nominated
I am.
podcast.
Yes. Very proud of that.
That's something to crow about. That's
I am.
Great.
I'm really proud of that. I tell people, I think I even have it on the description when they find this podcast. It's like a Rondo Hatton nominated.
When you meet people at parties, do you put Rondo nominated?
Of course.
Your name? Okay, great.
They have to. They're required to call me the Rondo Hatton nominated host caretaker of the Graveyard Show podcast.
Go.
All right, David. Thank you so much for coming on. It was fantastic having you. I can't wait to talk to you more when In Search of Tomorrow Part 2 comes out.
Awesome. Thank you so much as always. It's great to be at the Graveyard, and everybody take care.
And as I put this interview to rest, I think I've said it before. I'm going to say it again. I love having David on this show. He is so awesome. I don't even feel like it's an interview. It's a conversation. And he just makes it so easy. And there was just so much more I could have talked to him about. We could have done another 45 to an hour easily. So as he said, to find out more about this flash sale, go to 80shorrordoc.com. So that's 80shorrordoc.com. You can purchase the In Search of Darkness trilogy. You can do the trilogy bundle for $119.99 US. Okay. It includes Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. You get the 3-disc trilogy slipcase, which is beautiful. Beautiful. 3 posters. You get the membership card, digital copies of the film, the digital soundtrack, 4+ hours of extras digitally, and then the In Search of Darkness Challenge PDF, which will come digitally as well. If you want to see what these look like, go to my YouTube channel, Graveyard Show Podcast, on YouTube, and you can check it out. I did a feature I featured it on my other video podcast called The Caretaker Reveals. And it's all on the In Search of Darkness Part 3 swag bundle. You will see all of it and what it looks like. Now, you can also do Part 3 bundle, which is $69.99, and it comes with all the stuff as well that I just talked about that's in the trilogy set. You can also get the trilogy bundle digitally, which means you can get Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3 digitally only. That's $49.99. You can do Part 1 on Blu-ray for $49.99. You can do Part 2 on Blu-ray for $49.99. Or you could do Part 3 on Blu-ray for $59.99. And if you own the movies already and you did not get the trilogy slipcase, you can order that separately for $24.99 right there on 80shorrordoc.com. All right, as I begin to close down the graveyard, I want to revisit what I had mentioned at the top of the show, which is the show itself. So if you're a regular listener of the Graveyard Show podcast, thank you, first of all. It's always great having you here, and I appreciate your tuning in and listening to the podcast. I mentioned at the end of 22 that there was going to be more and more time in between podcasts. I'm starting to devote more of my time with the Graveyard Show Podcast YouTube channel because, well, there's just more for me to do, and it allows me more flexibility to do videos without having to try to schedule interviews with people. So if you are either just finding the Graveyard Show Podcast for the first time, or if you are just a podcast subscriber only, that's great, and I appreciate that. What you will get with your podcast subscription is the Graveyard Show Podcast and then the GYS Classics, which I upload every so often, which I just did in February. Those are revisiting old interviews that I did from 2009 and 10 and what The Undertaker, my fill-in host, did during 2009 and 2010 as well. We don't have any archives of those up online, so you can't find them anywhere. I have them here in my Graveyard archives. So I like to share them with you every so often because, none of you have heard them. So I did that back in February with the Corpse S. Chris interview. I will be uploading more this year. And, of course, I would love your comments on those. If you enjoyed them, if you liked them, if you didn't like them, anything you have, send them my way. You can either do that through the email address, which is gyspodcast@gmail.com, or if you're listening to it on YouTube, you can leave them in the comments section below as well. So the YouTube channel has a ton more content on it that you would get as opposed to being just a podcast subscriber. So with YouTube, if you go to youtube.com/@Graveyard Show Podcast, @Graveyard Show Podcast, you will find this program. And when you get to the home site, you will see a bunch of videos. So along with the Graveyard Show Podcast on YouTube, you will also get the GYS Classic Podcast as well. And then you also get video productions, one of which is Catacombs of Horror, which is about 20 to 40 minute video that I do regarding a movie or a topic in the horror community. So the 4 that are uploaded right now are What Represents 1980s Horror, and David Weiner actually joined me for that very first one, and he and I picked what we thought best represented 1980s horror in 4 different categories. The next one is my favorite scenes from Count Yorga Vampire, which is a huge hit. Y'all are eating that one up, which I always enjoy seeing the hits on that one. Also, Halloween 4, my favorite scenes and missed opportunity from that film. And then the last Catacombs of Horror is, Return of Count Yorga. Since Count Yorga Vampire Catacombs was so popular, I decided to do one on the sequel, Return of Count Yorga. And more and more of you are starting to find that and commenting on that as well. So that makes me happy. I'm working on a new Catacombs of Horror, and I should have that up very soon. There's another video production on there called The Caretaker Reveals, which is a much shorter video production. They're about 4 to 5 minutes long. It's things that I own or maybe have experienced that's related to horror or sci-fi. So I have several videos up for that, including actually the latest one that just went up, which was on my In Search of Darkness Part 3 swag bundle that I got when I purchased In Search of Darkness Part 3 several months ago. So I show you what I got in that swag bundle, and just gives you an idea what the folks over Creator VC do. Some of my other Caretaker reveals is the Blu-ray of Creepshow Season 3. I give a general description. I show you what the disc looks like. I show you a little bit of the video. Also, there was a play that I saw here in Los Angeles at the end of last year called 222, A Ghost Story. It's a spoiler-free review on the show. All these are spoiler-free, by the way. I don't get into anything that ruined the experience. I also did one on some of the shirts that I own from Fright Rags, as well as the In Search of Tomorrow bundle that I got last year when I purchased In Search of Tomorrow. So just some fun stuff. They're very short, quick. You can watch them literally 4 to 5 minutes, and there you go. Some other things you'll find on the GYS YouTube channel, the George A. Romero Wing, which is all things related to George A. Romero. I interviewed his widow a few years ago, Suzanne Desrochers Romero. I interviewed Kim Paffenroth, who wrote a book at the time on the 4 zombie films that Romero did. Anything that has to do with Romero is in that playlist. There's also an In Search of Darkness playlist. All my interviews that I did with David Weiner, Robin Block, Weary Pines, anything that has anything to do with In Search of Darkness, you can find it there as well. And I also have some old horror promos from the old horror podcasting network, from different shows that were on there. I have old promos for this show. Just anything that has to do with anything is kind of up there. So check it out. It's the Graveyard Show podcast on YouTube. So again, go to youtube.com/@Graveyard Show podcast. Just do not put the word "the" in there, and you will find me. All right. So that's going to do it here. As I said, stay tuned for the YouTube channel updates. And those of you that are listening just on podcast, I will have some more content coming your way as well. I do have some interviews planned. It's just this year I just don't see me doing very many original interviews because my schedule is going to be kind of crazy. So there you have it. All right, my friends, I look forward to seeing you back here in the graveyard very soon. Leave your comments below if you're on YouTube. And as you exit the graveyard, I would like to remind you to please lock the gate behind you. We wouldn't want anyone to get out. Until next time.
In Search of Darkness, all killer, no filler.
videotape revolution brought a new appreciation for horror films.
It was like this dam broke.
And it changed everything.
I think everybody with a camera and $10 made their own horror movies back then.
It was rental that made the thing explode.
This hopped up exploitation, a rawness and a grittiness.
Big and bold, over the top, and we were at a party.
My mom would have died if she knew some of the stuff that I was bringing home and watching.
Too many bombs.
The censors definitely clamped down on what was acceptable.
Well, parents and psychologists are very concerned.
Kind of in hysteria.
The satanic panic I thought was ridiculous.
All I ever wanted to do was figure out where I could get a Ouija board. I want to try this thing out.
It's that story, The Monkey's Paw. Be careful what you wish for.
Would you not run away?
There's a link between heavy metal and horror.
I was the DJ.
It's the sweeping sensation.
You're right here, right now.
It's unimaginable that people still care about this movie.
Yeah, the band are actually from hell. What do you know?
A weaponized guitar.
It's like the first sort of heavy metal horror movie for kids.
That movie came out right at the right time for my puberty.
And people were really starting to be curious about cultures and people.
Really creeped them out.
It shocked people that somebody would break the rules as much as we did.
But it worked out good for me.
I'm back and I'm kicking ass.
The mixture of humor and horror and social satire. How do you say it? Killing your babies?
It's beautiful.
Fresh bodies, fresh bodies, fresh.
You can tear up the furniture.
You can't believe the shit that's going on.
Evil kids are always going to be scary.
You're gonna die, die, die.
What are you talking about?
There's a lot of love and craft that I really appreciate.
I thought I could create magic.
It was diabolical.
It's so grimy and slimy.
It's unbearable to watch.
I might have been a bit too much for a mainstream audience.
I rode that appeal.
Something wrong with him. He makes this kind of movie.
Practical effects of the 80s. Sometimes they were not so glorious.
The most doofusy looking monster that you could imagine.
No, I wasn't worried about it going too far. I was worried about it not going far enough.
We were just kids having fun.
We're making movies. We're doing what we love.
And that's why we love these movies so much to this day.
People should champion anything that they enjoy. That's how you keep things alive.
What do you want?
I want you to stop me.
These movies aren't gonna go away.
It's one of the things that I am most proud of doing. I'm very nostalgic for the 80s.
I could watch 80s horror movies on a loop forever.
Probably made me into the weirdo that I am today. I don't know.